All right, everybody. I know that you guys have all taken English 111 and 112, and at some point, I hope, have written a literary analysis. But just in case you haven't or you want a refresher, I want to go through briefly kind of a crash refresher on writing a literary analysis and the components and everything that go along with that kind of writing. You can also look at the more detailed guidelines of writing a literary analysis in the essay number 1, explanation, expectations, etc. But this might save you some time instead of going through and reading all of that. But anyways, without further ado, writing a literary analysis. So what is a literary analysis? You guys should know that basically, like all writing is an argument, right? So a literary analysis is going to make an argument about validating or justifying the validity of your interpretation of a particular literary text. So some important literary concepts to consider. I know that you probably can't see the whole title, but some important literary concepts to consider when trying to figure out what you're going to analyze. You always want to go back to the basics, right? So look at the basic literary elements and how the text uses or treats those elements. For example, my favorite is always characterization or setting, symbol. But some other things to consider are things like historical context, political or social context, and ideology. A lot of these key concepts are going to go hand in hand with the basics. So you always want to think in terms of a literary analysis is looking at one of those basic literary elements and how it's treated in the text. So, in other words, a literary analysis involves a discussion of the text and uses certain contexts, like the ones that we just looked at, that are specifically associated with literature. An analysis is usually a discussion of various components of how an individual work relate to each other. You can look at two separate literary works and how they deal with similar concepts or forms. And ultimately, it's about how these concepts and forms in a literary work relate to larger social or religious political context. So there's always that larger implication, which we'll talk about a lot in this class, because there's always what is it saying about the culture? What is it saying about the time? What is it saying about the people? So or kind of the British, as it were. So, anyways, a literary analysis, at the heart of it, is an argument. You're going to focus on a specific attribute of the text. You're going to make a specific point through your thesis statement about these attributes, and then you are going to prove and justify or defend that point with reasons or evidence drawn from the text. Easy peasy, right? So the one thing that I kind of want to focus a little bit of attention to is the thesis statement component of a literary analysis, because those are kind of the most difficult to develop. So I have here, and I got this from the OWL Purdue website, and I want you guys to look at these statements to see which is the better one. And obviously, the shorter they are, the probably the less likely they are to be well done. And see which one is the better of these 4 statements. And if you've never had the privilege, I don't know if privilege is the right word, to read Moby Dick, consider yourself fortunate. So Moby Dick is about the problem of evil. And that may or may not have potential because it is about this idea of evil, but it's vague. It's not specific. It's not looking at a specific literary concept. It's not telling me anything. Moby Dick is pointless and boring. And while I agree with that, it's an opinion. It's not an argument because there's a difference. Moby Dick is about a big white whale. True, but it is a statement of fact, and thesis statements, remember, can't be statements of fact. The use of whiteness in Moby Dick illustrates the uncertainty of the meaning of life that Ishmael expresses through the novel. And of course, we know that this is going to be the best of the thesis statement because it's something that we can analyze. It's something that's open for debate. And it's looking at something specific like the use of whiteness and how that's going to illustrate a larger meaning or implication in the text. So when you're writing your literary thesis statements, make sure that you read the text and take notes on what you're reading. And I know that these are difficult and challenging texts, so I know that. So, but you want to make sure that you read and take notes, and then you look for patterns of questions or ideas that are of interest to you. What's the focus of those questions, and how does it help develop a theme? I will say that when moving to write your essay, you don't have to always have a solid thesis statement in mind. You can have a vague general idea. So I always suggest coming up with something tentative and then kind of figuring out the larger implication, the so what, because ultimately you're probably going to write yourself into that larger meaning, and then you can look at what you say in your conclusion and kind of tailor that and make it fit for your introductory thesis statement. But I'll talk about that in just a second. So anyways, when you're writing a literary thesis, you always want to look for patterns or ideas and what the focus of those questions or those patterns are on. So for example, my example is going to come from something that we are going to read. It is Malory's La Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur. And if I am looking at this to develop a thesis statement, maybe my interest, right, is how the author develops the theme, not the them, the theme of courtly love, because courtly love and that idealistic kind of love is something that's covered in almost all of the text that we're going to be reading in our first unit. So that's why I picked that theme. So I'm looking at how the author develops this theme of courtly love. So I have a question. What does Malory seem to be suggesting about the world, people in it, or life in general? In this question, regardless if it's Malory, if it's anybody else, this is the question you want to start with. What does the author seem to be suggesting about the world, people in it, or life in general? Because that's going to help you come up with and identify a theme. Well, my answer to that question is that he's suggesting that loyalty is more important than this socially constructed idea of love or idealistic love. So that's my answer, that loyalty is where it's at. It's not about love or the idealistic view of love. It's about loyalty. Some pitfalls when kind of coming up with a thesis statement is choosing too many ideas or choosing an idea without any support. So you want to be aware of those when you're kind of developing your thesis. So remember, the answer to my question is loyalty is where it's at. Loyalty. So after I have my answer to this kind of question, you want to ask another question. Well, how does Malory develop the idea that loyalty is more important? Through what literary elements? So my answer to that is he uses imagery, irony, and character development to allow the reader to focus on the male relationships and political alliances of the king and knight. So I've got kind of this idea of where I'm going with this thesis statement or with my paper because I'm looking at what literary elements, how does the author develop that idea of loyalty? So now I can put it together, so to speak. And you can turn that question and answer around because you've already answered your question, so you can put it in a form of a thesis statement. So for example, a thesis statement that I've come up with after asking all of these questions, looking at my notes, in his Lamort the Arthur, Malory diminishes the ideals of courtly love by creating a realistic view of knighthood that focuses on political loyalties rather than idealistic love. So that is a really good thesis statement because it has all of the parts that I need for a thesis statement. So let's look at the parts and I'll come back. So all thesis statements, your thesis statements, should include the title of the work, the name of the author, an active verb. So you're going to tell me what the author does. How does the author do it? How does the author achieve this? How does the author achieve this purpose? So through what literary element, through what kind of, through the text, what element of the text? And so what? Why does it matter? What's the larger implication? Why should I care, right? So let's go back and look at my Malory thesis statement and see if it's got all of those parts. So I have the title, right? Lamort the Arthur. I have the name of the author, Malory, Sir Thomas Malory. What does Malory do? What is my active verb? Well, he diminishes the ideals of courtly love. That's what he does. How does he do that? Well, he does this by creating a realistic view of knighthood. And he creates this realistic idea through imagery, hyperbole, and character development. Those three things that I answered in my first question. So he does this by creating this realistic idea of knighthood that focuses, why does this matter? Well, because it focuses on political loyalties rather than idealistic love. Okay, so does that make sense? I hope it does. But these are the three parts that your thesis statement is has got to have. So I have some examples of other thesis statements that you guys can go through because I'm going to put this PowerPoint up on Canvas so you can go back and look at it if you have any questions. But I have some examples of various different thesis statements that kind of highlight what it is that the type of thesis statements that we're going to be going for when you write your essays. Another example, in the tragical history of Dr. Faustus, Marlowe denies the concept of a tragic hero through his portrayal of Faustus. His death is not a tragedy because his arrogance prevents him from taking responsibility for his actions. So here again, and this is a text that we will read, all of the texts from the examples are things that we are going to be reading in class. So in the tragical history of Dr. Faustus, Marlowe, so I have my author and my title, what does he do? He denies the concept of a tragic hero. How does he do that? Through his portrayal of Faustus. So I've answered the questions, what my author does, how he does it. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because, well, at least my argument is that his death is not a tragedy because he doesn't take responsibility for his actions. So I've got all of these ideas. I've got my topic, my stance, my so what in my literary thesis statement. So go through and look at when you go to write your paper, make sure you go through and you ask yourself these questions to kind of develop a thesis statement. And as always, I am the thesis whisperer. So if you want help kind of figuring out what you want to write about and how to kind of develop that into a tentative thesis statement, please email me, come to my office hours, and I will be glad to help you come up with a thesis statement. So once you have your thesis statement, I'm going to wrap this video up and make another video in another part. Once you have your thesis statement, then you can focus on your body paragraph. So stay tuned. I'm coming right back and picking up with body paragraphs.